The morning sun should have risen over Constantinople, but instead, a sickly yellow glow barely pierced through the strange haze that had been gathering for days. Byzantine merchant Antonius stood at the harbor watching ships arrive from Egypt, and their crews spoke of the same disturbing phenomenon spreading across the Mediterranean world. The date was March 5th in the year 536 AD, and what began as an odd atmospheric disturbance would become 18 months of darkness that nearly ended civilization as humanity knew it. Within weeks, the sun would give no more light than the moon, while temperatures plummeted and summer snow would fall across 3 continents. Crops would fail from China to Ireland, and millions would die in the worst famine the world had ever experienced. This is the story of the year 536, when nature itself seemed to turn against humanity, and our ancestors faced an apocalypse that modern science is only now beginning to fully understand. If you're ready to look beyond the veil of forgotten myths and uncover the secrets the world chose to forget, subscribe to Inside Strange Times, so you won't miss new journeys into the realm of ancient mysteries. The Byzantine historian Procopius watched from the walls of Constantinople as farmers fled their fields, carrying whatever possessions they could manage, while their abandoned crops withered under the dim yellow sky. He would later write that the sun gave forth its light without brightness like the moon during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear. What Procopius was witnessing was not just a local phenomenon, but the beginning of a global catastrophe that would reshape the course of human history. In the imperial palace, Emperor Justinian convened his advisors, who brought disturbing reports from every corner of the empire. Ships arriving from Alexandria spoke of darkness over Egypt, while messengers from Antioch reported that crops were failing throughout Syria, and people believed the end times had arrived. The emperor, who had dreamed of restoring Rome's ancient glory, now faced a crisis unlike anything in recorded history, a crisis that no army could fight and no amount of gold could solve. Meanwhile, in a monastery perched on the rocky coast of Ireland, Brother Coleman recorded in the annals that there was a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. The monks had noticed the strange quality of light first during morning prayers, when the sun seemed unable to penetrate the mysterious veil that hung over their island. By summer, when frost killed their barley fields and snow fell in July, the brothers knew this was no ordinary bad weather, but something far more ominous. They began rationing their stores and praying for deliverance, while recording everything they witnessed for future generations who might need to know that such darkness once covered the earth. The Chinese chronicles tell an even more detailed story of environmental collapse across the Middle Kingdom. In the capital of Jiankang, the emperor of the southern Liang dynasty received reports that yellow dust fell like snow throughout the provinces, and the sun was obscured for months. The Nanxi records state that in the 11th month of the year 536 there was thunder and heavy snow fell, and that drought and famine struck the land south of the Yangtze River, causing massive death tolls. Provincial governors wrote desperate messages describing how peasants were eating tree bark and grass, while others fled their villages in search of food that simply did not exist anywhere. A Korean merchant named Park Jin-soo traveled the trade routes between Baekje and the Chinese coast during these dark months, and his family's records survived to tell of cities where 9 out of 10 shops stood empty and abandoned. He wrote that the harbors, which once bustled with merchants from across Asia, now held only ghost ships whose crews had died of starvation or disease. The few survivors he met spoke of cannibalism in remote villages and mass suicides of entire families who chose death together rather than watching their children starve. Park himself barely survived the journey home, where he found his own kingdom of Baekje suffering the same apocalyptic conditions. Modern ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica reveal the scientific truth behind these ancient testimonies, showing massive sulfate deposits that indicate one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history. Tree rings from this period, found everywhere from Scandinavia to California, show virtually no growth for the years 536 and 537, confirming that photosynthesis itself was failing on a global scale. The temperature data extracted from these natural archives indicates that 536 experienced the most severe short-term cooling event of the past 2,000 years, with average temperatures dropping by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius across the northern hemisphere. Back in Constantinople, the situation grew desperate as grain shipments from Egypt failed to arrive because the Nile floods had not come, and the wheat fields of North Africa produced nothing but dust. Procopius recorded that people began dying in the streets while others murdered for a handful of grain, and mothers were seen weeping over the bodies of children they could not feed. The imperial granaries that Justinian had filled during good years kept the capital from complete collapse, but in the countryside, entire villages simply disappeared as their inhabitants either died or fled. The bishop of Ephesus, named John, traveled through Anatolia during the worst of the crisis and left detailed accounts of ghost towns where doors stood open and valuables lay untouched because everyone had either fled or died. He found churches filled with corpses of people who had gathered to pray for salvation that never came, and monasteries where monks had starved at their posts rather than abandon their sacred duties. In one particularly haunting passage, John described finding a villa where an entire noble family had died together at their dinner table, apparently choosing poisoned wine over the slow agony of starvation. The archaeological record supports these written accounts with evidence of massive population decline and settlement abandonment across Europe and Asia during this period. Pollen analysis shows that agricultural lands reverted to forest in many regions as farming communities collapsed and were not reoccupied for generations. Coin hoards buried during 536 and never recovered suggest their owners died before they could return for their hidden wealth. Mass burial sites from Ireland to China contain remains showing clear signs of malnutrition and disease that swept through weakened populations. In the mountains of Switzerland, a young shepherd named Marcus watched his flock grow thinner each day as the grass refused to grow even in summer. His family's oral tradition, passed down for generations, told how he led his surviving animals higher and higher into the Alps searching for pasture until he reached elevations where no shepherd had ever needed to go before. There among the glaciers, he found the frozen bodies of travelers who had tried to cross the passes and died when summer never came. Marcus survived by slaughtering his animals one by one and trading the meat for grain in the valleys below where people paid anything for protein. The Mayan records from Central America provide a different perspective, showing that the catastrophe affected the New World as severely as the Old. Hieroglyphic inscriptions from Copan and other sites indicate crop failures and political upheaval during this exact period. Recent analysis of growth patterns in ancient trees from Guatemala and El Salvador show the same signature of reduced photosynthesis that appears in tree rings worldwide. Some researchers now believe that the massive eruption of Ilopango volcano in what is now El Salvador may have been the source or one of the sources of the global catastrophe. As 536 turned into 537, the darkness showed no signs of lifting and social order began breaking down across entire empires. In Gaul, which would later become France, Frankish warriors raided Roman settlements that could no longer defend themselves because soldiers had deserted to find food for their families. The carefully maintained Roman road system that had connected Europe for centuries fell into disrepair as no one had the resources or will to maintain infrastructure when survival itself was uncertain. Germanic tribes pushed deeper into former Roman territories, not as conquerors but as desperate refugees fleeing the famine in their own lands. A Syrian merchant named Elias attempted to maintain his trade network during these dark months, and his letters preserved in Egyptian ruins tell of cities where gold had become worthless because you could not eat it. He wrote that a single sack of grain commanded prices that would have bought entire estates just 2 years earlier, and that previously honest citizens turned to robbery and murder without hesitation. His final letter sent from Damascus in late 537 mentions that he had heard rumors of a terrible plague beginning to spread from Egypt, and that he feared this new horror would finish what the darkness and famine had begun. The Japanese chronicles from this period record that Emperor Senka died in 536, though they do not explicitly connect his death to the crisis. However, Buddhist monks writing at the time describe unprecedented cold and darkness that killed rice crops throughout the islands and led to widespread starvation. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a sharp decline in pottery production and metalworking, suggesting that specialized crafts collapsed as everyone focused solely on finding food. Several major settlements were abandoned during this time and were not reoccupied for decades, indicating massive population loss. In Britain, which the Romans had recently abandoned, the crisis accelerated the collapse of whatever Romano-British civilization had survived. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions great mortality during this period, while Welsh annals speak of the wasteland that Britain became. Archaeological digs show that many Roman villas that had continued functioning after the legions left were finally abandoned during 536 and 537. The sophisticated pottery industries that had survived the Roman withdrawal disappeared entirely, replaced by crude handmade vessels that suggest a complete collapse of specialized production. Modern climate models help us understand how a single volcanic eruption, or possibly multiple eruptions, could create such widespread devastation. When millions of tons of sulfur dioxide reach the stratosphere, they combine with water vapor to form sulfuric acid aerosols that reflect sunlight back into space. These aerosols can remain suspended for years and spread globally within months, creating a volcanic winter that affects the entire planet. The reduced sunlight not only drops temperatures, but also disrupts the monsoons and other weather patterns that billions depend on for agriculture. As 537 dragged into 538, some regions began to see slight improvement in the light, but the damage to human civilization was already catastrophic. In Constantinople, Justinian himself fell ill, though he survived while his dreams of restoring the Roman Empire died with the hundreds of thousands who had perished. The carefully recruited and trained armies he had assembled to reconquer the West melted away as soldiers deserted or died. The tax base that funded the empire collapsed as farmers fled their lands and cities emptied of taxpayers. The scientific detective story of what caused the darkness of 536 began in the 1980s when researchers studying ice cores from Greenland discovered massive sulfate spikes dated to exactly this period. These sulfate deposits, which form when volcanic sulfur dioxide combines with atmospheric moisture, were among the largest found in the entire 2,000-year record. When scientists drilled similar cores from Antarctica and found matching sulfate layers, they realized this was not a regional event, but a global atmospheric catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Tree ring analysis provided the next crucial piece of evidence as dendrochronologists examined ancient wood from Ireland to California to Siberia. Every sample showed the same dramatic pattern, where normal growth rings suddenly became paper-thin or completely absent for 536 and 537. The trees were literally recording starvation at the cellular level as photosynthesis failed due to reduced sunlight. Some trees showed frost damage in what should have been summer growth periods, confirming the ancient chronicles that describe snow falling in July. The volcanic hypothesis gained support when geologists began searching for eruptions powerful enough to inject millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. To create 18 months of global darkness would require a volcanic explosivity index of 6 or 7, equivalent to the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora that caused the year without a summer. The challenge was finding which volcano or volcanoes erupted in 535 or early 536 with enough force to trigger this catastrophe. The Ilopango volcano in El Salvador emerged as a prime candidate when radiocarbon dating of charred trees buried in its eruption deposits yielded dates consistent with 536. This massive caldera-forming eruption ejected an estimated 84 cubic kilometers of material, making it one of the largest volcanic events of the past 2 millennia. The eruption column would have punched through the stratosphere and injected sulfur aerosols directly into the jet streams that could distribute them globally within weeks. Recent studies of ash deposits across Central America confirm that Ilopango devastated hundreds of kilometers of surrounding territory, forcing mass migrations of Mayan populations. However, some scientists argue that Ilopango alone cannot explain all the evidence, particularly a second sulfate spike in ice cores dated to 540. This has led to theories of multiple eruptions, perhaps including volcanoes in Iceland or Indonesia, that created a devastating 1-2 punch against global climate. The Rabaul volcano in Papua New Guinea and several Indonesian volcanoes remain candidates, though definitive proof remains elusive. What seems certain is that the 536 event was either one super eruption or multiple large eruptions occurring within months of each other. The climate models show how volcanic winter works with terrifying efficiency. Sulfuric acid aerosols in the stratosphere create a reflective layer that bounces solar radiation back to space before it can warm Earth's surface. Unlike regular clouds, these aerosols stay suspended for years because there is no rain in the stratosphere to wash them out. The reduced solar radiation not only drops temperatures but disrupts the temperature differences between equator and poles that drive weather patterns, causing droughts in some regions and floods in others. The immediate consequences of 536 were catastrophic, but the long-term effects shaped the next 1,000 years of human history. The weakened and malnourished populations that survived the famine had no resistance when the Plague of Justinian arrived in 541. This first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague spread from Egypt through the Mediterranean world and killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, perhaps half the population of the Byzantine Empire. Modern genetic analysis of plague bacteria from this period confirms it was the same Yersinia pestis that would return 800 years later as the Black Death. Emperor Justinian, who had survived both the famine and the plague, watched his empire shrink as territories he had conquered in North Africa and Italy slipped away. The Byzantine Empire would never again come close to restoring the territorial extent of ancient Rome. The resources that might have maintained Roman civilization were consumed by simple survival, and the complex administrative and military systems that had endured for centuries finally collapsed under the combined weight of famine, plague, and social breakdown. In Western Europe, the crisis of 536 accelerated transformations that historians traditionally mark as the beginning of the Dark Ages. The urban centers that had characterized Roman civilization emptied as people fled to the countryside where they might grow their own food. Long-distance trade networks that had connected Britain to Egypt and Spain to Syria dissolved as merchants could no longer find goods to trade or safe routes to travel. Classical learning retreated into monasteries where monks preserved what texts they could, while the secular schools that had educated Roman elites disappeared. The demographic collapse was staggering, with some regions losing 70 to 80% of their population to famine and plague. Entire ethnic groups disappeared from the historical record, while others migrated vast distances, searching for habitable lands. The Slavic peoples expanded from their homeland to fill depopulated territories in Eastern Europe. The Avars pushed westward from Central Asia into the power vacuum left by weakened empires. Anglo-Saxons consolidated their hold on Britain as Romano-British resistance collapsed. Archaeological evidence reveals how thoroughly civilization retreated during this period. Coin production, which requires specialized knowledge and centralized authority, virtually ceased in many regions. The standardized pottery that had been mass-produced in Roman factories was replaced by crude handmade vessels. Stone construction gave way to wood and thatch, as communities lost the resources and expertise for monumental architecture. Roads that had been maintained for centuries became overgrown tracks, as no authority remained to organize their repair. In China, the crisis contributed to the fall of the southern dynasties and ushered in decades of political fragmentation. The mandate of heaven concept meant that natural disasters were seen as signs that the emperor had lost divine favor. When crops failed and darkness covered the land for 18 months, the political legitimacy of rulers evaporated. Regional warlords seized power in the chaos, while nomadic peoples pressed in from the northern steppes. The carefully maintained irrigation systems that supported Chinese agriculture fell into disrepair, causing agricultural productivity to remain depressed for generations. Some societies adapted better than others to the crisis, and their survival strategies offer lessons for modern civilization. In Ireland, monasteries became centers of resilience, where communal living and shared resources helped communities survive when individual families could not. The monks' practice of copying texts preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost when secular institutions collapsed. Their chronicles provide some of our best records of the crisis, precisely because they maintained literacy when others focused solely on survival. In Scandinavia, communities that had always lived on the margin developed strategies that would later power the Viking expansion. The crisis forced innovation in shipbuilding and navigation as people searched farther for resources. The social structures that emerged from this period emphasized raiding and trading over farming, adaptations that made sense when agriculture could fail so catastrophically. The cultural memory of the Fimbulwinter, or Great Winter, before Ragnarok may preserve echoes of the 536 catastrophe. The recovery from 536 took generations, and some regions never fully recovered their former prosperity or population. Climate data shows that while the worst of the volcanic winter ended by 538, temperatures remained below normal for the entire decade. Agricultural systems take years to rebuild after such disruption, as soil fertility depletes and seed stocks disappear, and farming knowledge is lost when entire communities die. Trade networks require trust and stability that take even longer to reestablish after such complete breakdown. The Plague of Justinian continued to recur in waves for the next 2 centuries, preventing population recovery just when communities began to rebuild. Each outbreak would kill 10 to 20% of the population in affected areas, keeping societies trapped in subsistence mode. The complex urban civilization that had characterized the Roman world became impossible to maintain with such demographic instability. Cities that had housed hundreds of thousands shrank to towns of mere thousands. Modern analysis suggests that the 536 event caused a cascade of systemic failures that no amount of preparation could have prevented. The Roman Empire had sophisticated granaries and food distribution systems, but these assumed temporary local shortages, not 18 months of global crop failure. The administrative competence that Rome was famous for meant nothing when there was simply no food to administrate. Military might could not fight volcanic winter, and economic wealth became worthless when markets ceased to exist. If a similar volcanic event occurred today, the consequences would be both less and more severe than in 536. Modern agriculture could partially compensate through greenhouse cultivation and artificial lighting, but only for a tiny fraction of global food needs. Food reserves in developed nations might last months instead of weeks, but global population is 20 times larger than in 536. International cooperation could mobilize resources unimaginable to ancient empires, but our just-in-time supply chains are far more fragile than the localized economies of the past. Climate scientists estimate that a volcanic winter today would reduce global agricultural output by 60 to 70% for at least 2 years. The resulting famine would affect billions rather than millions, with developing nations suffering catastrophic mortality. Nuclear powers facing starvation might resort to resource wars that could escalate beyond conventional conflict. The electronic systems that coordinate modern civilization would continue functioning, but social order might not survive the pressure of billions facing starvation. The Toba supervolcano eruption 74,000 years ago nearly drove humanity extinct with genetic evidence, suggesting our species went through a bottleneck of perhaps 10,000 individuals. The 536 event was far smaller than Toba, but it still brought organized civilization to the brink of collapse. Today, we monitor volcanoes with satellites and seismographs, but we still cannot prevent eruptions or fully prepare for their consequences. The Yellowstone supervolcano could erupt tomorrow or in 50,000 years, and despite all our technology, we would have perhaps weeks of warning. Yet the story of 536 is ultimately one of human resilience in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Our ancestors faced 18 months of darkness without understanding what caused it or when it would end. They watched their children starve and their civilizations crumble, but enough survived to rebuild. The monks who kept copying manuscripts by candlelight when the sun failed preserved the knowledge that would eventually spark the Renaissance. The farmers who saved their seed grain instead of eating it ensured that agriculture could resume when the light returned. The Byzantine Empire survived, though diminished, and preserved Greek and Roman knowledge that would have otherwise been lost. China reunified after the chaos and entered the Tang Dynasty Golden Age just decades later. Islamic civilization rose from the Arabian Peninsula to fill the vacuum left by weakened empires, preserving and advancing science and mathematics. The catastrophe of 536 reshuffled human civilization but did not end it. Modern volcanic monitoring gives us capabilities that would seem magical to those who lived through 536. We can detect magma movement kilometers underground and measure gas emissions that precede eruptions. We understand the chemistry of volcanic winter and could theoretically deploy geoengineering to counteract it, though such interventions carry their own risks. We have global food reserves and transportation systems that could redistribute resources, though whether political will would survive such crisis remains unknown. The darkness that fell in 536 stands as history's starkest reminder that nature remains the ultimate force governing human destiny. All our civilizations exist within narrow parameters of temperature and sunlight that volcanic eruptions can shatter in an instant. We build our cities and empires on a thin crust floating atop molten rock that occasionally reminds us of our true position in the cosmic order. The year 536, when the sun disappeared, teaches us that survival requires not just technology and organization, but the fundamental human capacity to endure when everything else fails. Those who lived through the 18 months of darkness could not know they were experiencing one of history's great turning points. They only knew that the sun had failed and winter would not end, and death stalked every household. Yet they endured through communal bonds and individual courage and simple, stubborn refusal to surrender. Their survival through the worst year to be alive in recorded history proves that humanity can endure even when the sun itself disappears. The light always returns, though it may take 18 months of darkness to appreciate its gift.